on this computer. Okay, awesome. So hopefully everybody can see my console. And we're going to start just talking a little bit about what Django is before we start setting things up. So what we've been doing for the past week or so is, or I guess past few weeks, is we've been talking about, using Python and JavaScript to make scripts that can do things, right? We can write algorithms. We can get data from CSV files or Excel sheets and import them into Python and JavaScript and do stuff with them. We just learned how to create databases using SQL and Postgres. And we also talked about how we can interact between our databases and Python. So that's sort of like the first part of our grand full stack vision. So everything we've been doing until now is basically all back-end stuff. So everything relating to like your databases, your data for now is basically the back-end side of things. But starting with the module that we're in today, which is the start of the Django module, we're going to start transitioning from only talking about things we're dealing with algorithms and data and databases and processing and all that. And we're going to gradually start working towards how do we put the stuff that lies on our computer in our database or whatever onto a website that people can see that looks nice and isn't just a code run in somebody's terminal. And one tool that we'll be using very heavily that helps us do this is Django. So Django is something that helps us interface between Python and our databases. But crucially, Django is also something that we can use to help us interface with our static web page. So if you were to, let's say you have a database of houses. So you have you're running like a real estate company or something, and you have a grand database of houses in SQL. How do we display those houses on a web page? Well, or let's say in addition to displaying houses on a web page, I want to give my users the ability to create new houses, select certain houses, just like your standard SQL stuff. But I want to give them the ability to do that on a website. How can I do that? That is sort of where Django comes in handy. So Django is essentially creating a go-between between your database and your front-end web page using Python. And that is what we're going to be talking about in more detail today. All right, so first off, let me just do a dir. Let me change directory into my demos. And yeah, okay, this should be fine. So before we get started with Django, there is something that I want to discuss first. Well, I guess first I should probably make a directory, and we can call this Django. I'll call this Django demo echo because I already have another one, and we'll change directory into that. If anybody would like to code along, you're more than welcome to do so as well. So whenever we start a new project in general, whether this is a Django project, which is what we're going to be doing for quite a while, or any programming project, you want to make sure that we are creating that project in its own basically mini environment. So this is basically what I'm saying is we need to create something called a virtual environment. It's kind of similar to a Docker container in that it holds stuff that can't be accessed outside it. But the purpose of a Python virtual environment is to create, I guess you could say, a place that holds all of your Python related installations. So it'll hold, if you install any packages, your virtual environment can install those. It'll install a copy of Python. And the reason for this is, do you really want your local machine to have if you're running 10 projects and each of those projects uses each of those 10 projects uses like 10 dependencies or 10 libraries. Your local machine is going to have 100 libraries on it. That's a lot of libraries. Now, if you just install all 100 libraries in the same place, you're not going to know which project is using, let's say, a machine learning library and which project is using a data processing library. So by using virtual environments, like I'm going to do in like 2 minutes, we can essentially containerize our dependencies so that each project that we work on only has the dependencies that it needs and nothing else. So now that I'm in my special little Django demo echo folder, we see that there's nothing inside of it. So before we get started on our Django, I'm going to start by creating a virtual environment. So the first thing that I'm going to do is say Python, and then -m and venv. So this is basically saying Python, make me a virtual environment, which is venv. And I usually call my venv just venv. You can pick any name you want for it. It doesn't really matter. And we give it a second. It shouldn't tell us anything, so that's fine. We'll do a dir, and we see here that I now have a folder called venv, which means that my virtual environment has been created. Now, the next thing I need to do is actually go into my virtual environment and enter it. So in order to do that, we're not going to change directory into it, but instead we're going to say source and then venv/bin/activate. And when you type that, again, this will work for people on Mac, Linux, or if you're on Windows, put this in your WSL shell. When you type source/venv/bin/activate, this basically says, hey, I'm going to now activate my virtual environment. So everything that I do whenever I have little venv in parentheses before my my directory is all going to be running using whatever things I've installed inside of my virtual environment. So how can we check what things are installed in our virtual environment? Well, we can just type pip list. And as we see here, there's literally 2 things in our virtual environment, and Python, of course. We have Python, we have pip, which is our Python package installer, and we have setup tools. That's it. Now, if, let's say my computer, I installed like Python and pip and scicop-g2 and testing libraries and who knows what else. By creating this virtual environment here, we're basically creating a sanitized testing demo or development environment that we can do our work in without having to bother about any of the other stuff that we have on our computer. Okay, so now that we've 1, created my virtual environment, and 2, activated it, note that I'm not in my virtual environment folder. I'm still in my Django demo echo bigger broad folder. So the next thing I need to do is once I know I've activated my virtual environment, which you can do again by typing source and then the name of it /bin/activate, and then double checking that you have venv with the parentheses, I'm now going to install Django. And that is basically just going to say pip install Django. We let it run, maybe a little bit faster. Perfect. So I've now installed Django. And as we can see here, it says it's been collected and successfully installed, which is exactly what we're looking for. So the next thing that I want to do is I need to actually start a project. So we're going to be creating a Pokédex project, just like from the game Pokemon, where we're going to create a bunch of Pokemon and put them in a Pokédex, hopefully relatively self-explanatory. So in order to do that, we're going to just type Python -m, and then, so Python -m basically will be something that we use very, very, very frequently for the next few weeks. So keep this like burned into your brain. And we're going to say Python -m and then Django, which is saying, hey, Python, do something that relates to the Django plugins. And we're going to say start project, which is, well, starting a brand new project. And we're going to call this thing Pokédex proj, P-R-O-J. And we're going to put a full stop on it, or at the end. Do not forget the full stop. If you don't put the full stop on there, then it will mess up the Django folders a little bit, which is not something that we want to do. So basically, by putting this full stop here, it's going to create a brand new Pokedex project folder and to create a bunch of subfolders under that. If you don't put the period there, it will remove a couple of those or one of those folders and mess up the orientation. So keep the period there. So again, it's Python -m Django start project, the name of your project, we're calling it Pokedex project, and then your period. And let's hit that. Okay, nothing happened. That is terrible. Well, if I type dir, we now see that I have a couple things in here. I have a manage.py, which is, well, a Python script. I have my Pokédex project, which is exactly what I said we wanted to create, and my virtual environment. So I'm also just going to enter into my VS Code very quickly. That was not supposed to happen. Okay, maybe install a little bit faster. Okay, perfect. And now that's opening. And here, let me just share my whole screen while I'm at it. So if you do code when you're inside there, we should be able to poke around inside our folders and see what we've got. So we have our virtual environment, which has a plethora of folders inside it. I don't know why my VS Code is running slowly right now. Okay, can everyone else hear me okay?
Hey, Umar, I was gonna say, is that just me?
No, you're breaking up pretty badly.
Yeah, same for me too.
Okay, what about now?
Seems good now.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. All right. Apparently, my computer really does not like to not be updated, so I think that might be what's going on. Oh well.
Oh, it's happening again.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna pause the recording real quick and try to. Okay, so hopefully everything should be kind of sort of back to normal now. So let's get back to it. So inside our Django demo folder, we now have a couple of things. Number one is a manage.py, which we're not going to touch. Then we've got our virtual environment folder, which we're also, guess what, not going to touch. And then we have our Pokedex project inside here. So this contains a couple of files. We're not going to worry about the init, ASGI, and WSGI files, but the settings.py file basically contains all of the settings for our project. So this has like a secret key, which we won't talk about today. That'll be for a few weeks from now. We have a list of installed apps. We'll get to that more shortly. It's got URLs, which we'll get to relatively soon as well. It's got databases, which is something that we are going to be playing with very shortly. So remember, Django's entire purpose for us is to interface between our SQL databases and our Python stuff. So this is pretty important. Also, something fun we can do with Django is pack forward lock stuff. So if you are creating a database and you have users, but you don't want those users to have access to like be able to delete your entire database and stuff, you can create authentication within Django. That's not exactly related to the thing on the screen right now, but you can create an authentication thing within Django to basically create users, one, and two, stop your users from accessing stuff that they aren't supposed to, which is kind of cool. Otherwise, everything else we don't really need to worry about. And URLs, we will get to this a little bit later. But yeah, I think that's probably good for now. Also, here, let me see if I can pop open a terminal in here as well. In my VENV. Perfect. Okay, so I can go ahead and close out of this guy. And you guys can still see my VS Code, correct? Great. So now that we've created our virtual environment and our Django project, the next thing that I want to do is get all of my dependencies. So remember, if I do pip list right now, we've got a couple of things installed, right? We've got this ASGIREF, Django, pip, setup tools, SQL parse, typing extensions. I mean, that's a good number of things. So what I want to do is make sure that we record all of these dependencies. So what we're going to do is we're going to take everything in pip and freeze it. There's literally a pip freeze command, and freeze it all to a requirements.txt file. And why are we doing this? Well, we'll see in a second. Let me type requirements.txt, make sure I'm in the folder I want to be in. And if we go to this requirements.txt file, we see here that it basically tells us the version numbers and the names of all the packages that we have installed. Why is this useful? Well, let's say I have a friend called Bob, and I need to send Bob my code. Now, I do not want to send Bob my virtual environment folder, because my virtual environment folder has like literally hundreds of thousands of files in it. Please do not send Bob or anybody your virtual environment folder, because that thing is massive. Let's say that I'm just going to instead just send Bob my project code. But if I just send him the code and I've installed a bunch of packages in my virtual environment, he has no way of accessing those packages that I've installed. How does he know what packages he needs to install to run my code? Well, I can just send him this requirements.txt file that tells him exactly what packages I have running. And he can install all of these packages by just doing a pip install and then -r, which basically says, hey, what file am I going to install all of my pip things from? And then just requirements.txt. So it's always a good idea whenever you create a virtual environment and install a bunch of Python packages in it to save your Python packages in a requirement.txt using pip freeze. Okay, so any questions about anything I've talked about so far before we keep moving on?
The typing extensions requirement, is that unique to you? Because I don't know, I don't have that one.
That very well may be. I'm actually not sure. But let's go with yes. That is unique to me.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, let me look that up, because I haven't looked into that too much myself either. Typing extensions, Python, Django. Okay, from a like 20-second look, I'm not completely sure what that does or why it's installed. But it looks like it is, and I'm not going to remove it. But if it's not installed for you, that's probably fine as well. Okay, any other questions before we continue? Awesome, no questions. So let's actually get started from turning our project into something that we can actually use. So let's start by creating a Django app. So an app is basically like a mini project. So why do we need apps? Well, a project is something that's basically used for one website. So think about a website like eBay. So eBay, the website, has a bunch of different parts, right? It has like the part where you can chat with sellers. It has a part for like users to log in and make accounts. It has a part for like all of the different products available, like etc. So all of those are under one project, but each of those like functionalities or like parts of the site is part of an individual app. So a project, in this case, Pokedex project, has many apps, which is what we're going to build next. So in order to build an app, one, make sure that we're in the same folder as our manage.py, which I can confirm by doing dir or ls. And we see I've got my manage.py right there as we want. And now we're going to create a new app. We're going to say manage.py and then start app. And we're going to call this one Pokemon app. And we don't need a full stop at the end of this guy. We run it, give it a second, and we now see that inside of my Pokedex, inside of my Django demo echo folder, I now have one folder for my project and one folder for my app. Don't worry about all of the different files that have been created inside that app just yet. We will get there very shortly. Okay, so when we create an app, let's go back to our settings.py file in here. So if we go down a little ways, remember that we talked about this install the apps thing? Well, that doesn't just apply to the default apps that are like Django, Contrib, like messages and admin, etc. This also applies to apps that you personally create and embed in your Django. So, example here, we've just created a brand new app called Pokemon app. So we're going to add in the Pokemon app to our list of apps. Yeah, that's about it for this stage. So the next thing that we're going to do is figure out how to do the thing that everybody, I'm sure, has been very eagerly waiting for, or not, but hopefully you were, which is connecting our Postgres databases with Django, or more accurately, using Django to connect Postgres with Python. So how can we do this? Well, we're first going to need to create a new database and create a table. Then once we create our database, we can add it to our list of databases and start messing with it. However, before we do all of that, we're going to be Dockerizing things. And to do that, we need to start by creating a Docker compose.yml file. So in the root of our project, which means outside of all the folders, so minimize all your folders, that's usually what I do at least, I'm going to create a Docker compose.yml file. And inside this file, I am not going to install any extensions right now because I don't want to. Inside of this Docker compose.yml file, we're going to insert a bunch of things. I'm going to copy paste these in right now, and then we'll talk about what they are. So let me find the place I need to copy paste from. Scroll, resume, and paste. And all of this is in the curriculum page for today, which is Module 5, Week 12, Day 1. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff in our Docker compose.yml file. So let's break down what all of these are. Well, this is obviously going to be related to your Docker version. And this is all of the stuff that we are going to be running inside of our Docker container. Well, the first thing that needs to know is the database. So this is all information about our database that we're running. The image of the database is going to be Postgres version 15. The environment settings are saying what my Postgres user and password are and which database I'm using. So the user and password are both set to Postgres for now, and the database that I'm in is the Pokedex database, which again will be created. Then we have to set up our ports. So that's for port mapping, which if you guys will remember from last week is basically the thing that we had to do manually. Well, now we can just do it inside of our Docker compose. And then volumes, which is this guy down at the end, will tell us that we want us to basically save the database on our computer if we shut down the Docker container that we're going to run. We're not going to run this file just yet, but we will do this pretty shortly. So any questions about the Docker compose file before we move on to going back to Django?
So quick question, can you hear me?
Yes.
So before we needed to create like a Docker container for each like part. Now we're creating a big one that covers everything. And I'm guessing eventually we have to type more stuff depending on what we want to create containers for, right?
Yes, that's correct. So if you need to, let's say, run 2 databases at once, then, well, you can add in another database entry into here. But most of the time, it'll just be one database for your project, and you can run everything in the same Docker Compose. Any other questions?
So is Docker Compose just coordinating a lot of separate containers or just one big container?
So right now we're just going to use it for one container, but it can be used for coordinating things between multiple containers. That's the whole purpose of Docker Compose. Okay, so now we've talked about the Docker Compose file. Again, I believe Chad provided more details about the specifics of each of these fields and how they work in the material for today. I'm happy to talk about specifics if anybody has questions, but for now, we're just going to keep moving forward with the Django part. So once you've created your Docker Compose file, make sure to save it. I'm going to go back to settings.py, and the next thing that we want to do is change this database information. So as you can see here, it says the engine is going to be SQLite 3. Well, we're not using SQLite 3. We're using Postgres 15. How do I tell Django that I don't want to use SQLite 3? Well, the first thing we need to do is change this from .SQLite3 to .PostgreSQL. Then we can change the name of this to what the name of our database is. And the name of our database, if you'll remember, is PokédexDB. And we need to add in a few more fields. So let me go ahead and try split screening that really quick, and we'll move the cameras. Perfect. So in addition to specifying the engine and name, we also need to tell Django how to get into the database. So to do that, we're basically going to copy paste, or not copy paste, but duplicate a bunch of the things in our Docker Compose in our databases as well. So for example, we'll set the user is going to be, what should we say? We said the user was Postgres. We'll set the password is going to also be Postgres. And there's a couple of other things that we need to do. The next thing is we need to say what host this is running on. So keep in mind, we can access Django, or Django can access databases that are not located on your local host. We won't get into that tonight, but that's why it's important to specify where your database is running. In our case, we know it's going to be running on localhost, and it's going to run on, well, my machine. And we're going to specify the port is going to be, well, it's going to be one of these two guys. Which one? Well, remember that this arrangement sets up port forwarding, which is, again, what we talked about last time. So 5454 is going to get mapped / forwarded to 5432. So the port that we want, which is the port that this Docker Compose is going to be referring to, is 5454, which is where everything for us is going to be running. And we can go ahead and save that. So now our databases have been set up in both Django and Docker Compose. So I'm going to go here and we'll say Docker and then Compose, and we're going to say up and make sure I'm in the right folder. I am. Give it a second and hope it works. And as we can see, it's doing its magic. It's pulling its databases and doing stuff. Is anybody else also seeing the same thing that I am right now, just to make sure that we're all at the same place?
Mine is still loading as well, but not the exact same place per se, but it's doing the whole thing.
Okay, perfect. So is anybody having trouble getting to this stage? Because I do know that the Docker Compose stuff is a little bit new, and dealing with Docker is not the easiest thing.
So I did it, but it just did a bunch of files saying like running Bootstrap and stuff like that.
Okay.
Actually, right there.
So
Well,
all
you
this.
have right there. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So that's good.
I don't know if I'm missing a step, but it says compose is not a Docker command.
Interesting. Okay.
But
Here,
I'm also
just
on Windows, so
Are you using the Windows shell for Linux, Joyce?
Yes, I'm using WSL, yeah.
Okay, because I'm using the exact same thing, and that should definitely not be happening.
Yeah.
Um,
Is your
have
daemon
you-
running?
Hmm?
Is your daemon running? You got the Docker desktop open?
Oh, it is not. Sorry.
Oh,
Maybe that's why.
I've done that a million times. No, that's how I know.
Thank you. I'll try it again with the Docker open.
all right, sounds good. Is anybody else having trouble getting to this point? All right, if everybody else has gotten here successfully, we should be good. So I'm going to keep this Docker terminal running, and I'm going to open up a second terminal. And this is, again, make sure that you're in your virtual environment before we do any of this, because we're going to go back to installing things. So the next thing that I'm going to install is going to install scicopg3. So we're going to say pip install, and we're going to say scicopg. Let me make sure that the format of this install is right. Scicopg and then binary. So wait for everything to load. And we've installed scicopg3, which is good. That's what we wanted. We have to type it as scicopg binary, because if you just type scicopg, it will not install correctly, unfortunately. So we're also, oh, go ahead.
What's the big difference between Scicop G3 and G2 that we use with Flask?
That is a good question. As far as I'm aware, it should just be a version difference, but I'm not sure. Usually people will use either Scicop G2 binary or Scicop G3, but my guess is that Scicop G2 is used more just because it's older and more of a legacy thing. But that is a good question. I'll look into that after lecture ends, though.
Cool.
Any other questions? Okay, so also just make sure that we're going to do our pip list as well. And we see here that pip and scicopg and scicopg binary have been installed. So I'm also just going to go ahead and can anybody remind me how we can freeze our pip installs into a requirements file before we keep going?
Pip freeze and a greater than sign. Requirements text.
Yep. So let's just do that very quickly. And I'll go to my requirements.txt file, and it's been updated with scicopg and scicopg binary. So everything that I've installed is in my requirements.txt file, which is great. Okay, so we are now completely configured and ready to go to actually start integrating our Django stuff with SQL. So where we're going to go is we're going to go to models.py. There's nothing here. Why is that? And what are models? So models in Django are basically the foundation of your project. So a model is basically a table in your database. So you can have a model for, basically anything you have, you put in your database. If you are going back to that like housing example, if you're like working in real estate and you have a bunch of houses that you need to sell and you're creating a Django project for it, you would probably create a Django model for a house because you'd have a database of houses or a table of houses. You could create a model for a buyer or a seller. You could create a model. Yeah, those are probably the main ones. But basically, a model is if you know you're going to create a table for something in SQL, or you need to store data about something, you're going to turn that thing into a Django model. So how can we do that? Well, first off, we are going to, again, import models from Django .db, because again, models are related to your databases. And we're now going to create a new model. So obviously, since we're creating a Pokedex and a Pokemon app, well, we should probably create a model for our Pokemon. So we'll say that this is going to be a class called Pokemon. So all of our models are classes. Now, this isn't just going to be a regular class, though. This is going to inherit from models.model. Why are we doing this? Well, the reason we're inheriting from models.model is so that Django will recognize that this is not just some random class. This class is a model, and a model belongs in a database. So by saying that Pokemon inherits from model.model, I'm telling Django to create a new table of Pokemon in my Django database, or in my Postgres database, sorry. So now we should probably create a couple of fields in our table/model. We do not need to create an ID field when we are creating a model in Django. That's something important to know. However, we do need to create all the other fields. So for example, we can create, let's say, a name, and we're going to make the name, we can see that there's a bunch of different field options here. You've got like integers, binary, character fields, date, time, decimal, email. There's a lot of choices. For now, though, we're just going to stick with a simple character field, and or known as a char field. And we'll have this have a maximum length. Well, you can also see here that each field has a bunch of different options. You can have it be set to null. You can have it be a primary key. You can have it, there's nothing else relevant to what we'll talk about right now, but you can have it be serialized. You can put validators on it. These are all things we're going to get to. But for the main thing that we're going to do right now is just specify that this guy is going to be a character field, and this character field is going to be 255 characters long. Easy peasy. Now, the next thing we want to do is also give our Pokemon a level. And for our level, we can look back at our fields, and we're going to make this an integer field. And we're going to, so that way it only allows whole number numerical values. And we're going to set the default value of this to be 1. What does the default mean? Well, if you don't put in a value, your Pokemon is automatically going to start at level 1. If you set your Pokemon's value, well, it won't be level 1 anymore. But if you don't put in a value, then it will say that your Pokemon is, well, level 1. All right, so let's go ahead and turn our model now into something that goes in our database. So the first thing that we need to do is turn this from just a Python class into something that Django can then turn from a Python class into our database table. So to do that, remember that we still need to be in the same folder as our manage.py. I'm going to check that with dir, have manage.py right there. So I'm going to say Python manage.py, and we're going to first make migrations. Did I type that right? Make migration. Yes. We run that, and it'll tell us when we do that what Django just did. So it says it created a migration in our Pokemon app, and it said that it created a model Pokemon. So creating a model, again, means that it takes this class and recognizes, hey, this is a model. A model is related to my database. I'm going to remember this for the next step. So we can, for example, go into our migrations folder, and we see here that this has created a migration class. It's created a model with an ID, a name, and a level. And yeah, everything else looks pretty good. So once we've created our migration, or once we've made our migration, and we've told Django to anticipate that we have something we want to put in our database, how can we actually put this in our database? Well, to do that, we say Python manage.py, and then we migrate all of our migrations. And we run migrate, and it'll run a few things. We see everything says okay, and it says it applies all our migrations, and everything looks okay. So that's great, but what can we do next? The next thing we want to do, obviously, is check that, well, did this thing actually work or not? So I'm going to just create a new shell just to double check that. And I'm going to scroll down a little ways, and we're going to just double check that we have a Pokemon app table that is called Pokemon, because that's what we said to specify the name of the table was. So we're going to double check that using this Docker command. So we're going to say exec into my Pokemon example database. You're going to use psql-h on localhost on port 5432 and double check that I'm entering into my Pokedex database. No such container. All right. What container is running? Is it going to be this guy? Let's see. Go back to bash. We'll change Django Pokemon example DB, and we'll change it to, okay, that deleted too much. Let's try that again. IT, and we'll paste. No, that wasn't what I wanted to paste in. Nope. Okay, here, let me do that one more time. So this is Django demo echo db1. So we go back here. Let's say Docker exec -it. We paste in the name, psql-h localhost -p5432-u, and run it. Ta-da! Okay, perfect. So just make sure that you have the name of your Docker container matching up with the Docker container that's actually running. So now, I mean, look at this. We know this interface really well. We are in our Pokedex database. This is just normal SQL. So can anybody remind me, how do I check what tables are in a database? I'm going to I'm going to call on somebody who hasn't spoken yet today. Let's see. Chris Gailey, hello. Can you tell me how to check all of the tables in a SQL database?
I think it's /DT.
All right, so it's /T, you said?
DT.
DT. All right, let's see what happens. Didn't work.
Maybe just try T.
Okay, that also didn't work.
I don't know then.
Okay, no worries, but thank you for trying. Anybody else want to give it a shot?
I think it's just the D, right?
/D? Okay, let's see. That
So
doesn't do it either.
I think it's a different
Must be
slash.
backslash.
Yeah.
Okay, that'd do it. So, yes, it was the wrong slash, but that's okay. This happens. All right, so what on earth is all of this? Because I know I definitely did not tell it to create half of these tables. Like, look how many tables there are. I mean, we've got we've got a lot of tables, and we should probably talk about what all of these are. If you take a look, literally half of these tables start with auth. That means half of these tables are related to user authentication. We don't have anything built for user authentication, so we don't have to worry about those tables. The next one is for Django admin. That is something we're going to talk about a little bit later. Don't worry about that right now. Content type, don't worry about that one. Migrations is pretty important because the Django migrations table keeps track of all of the different things that we're doing with our models. So if we delete this model, if I create a brand new one, etc., that'll all be tracked in our migrations folders and in our migrations table. Then we also have our Pokemon app Pokemon table, which is exactly what we expect. So that looks good. We go ahead and just do that. All right, sweet. So we have our Pokemon app Pokemon table, which is great. Now, The next thing I want to do is double check all of the columns in my Pokemon table. So let's see, who else hasn't spoken yet today? Philip Bastley, hello. Can you tell me how to view a table in SQL?
Yeah, you could just do like select star from Pokemon app, right? Or Pokemon underscore app Pokemon.
Yep. And is there anything I need at the end here, or can I just run it like so?
The semicolon.
Semicolon. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Okay, didn't like that. Let's do that now. Okay, perfect. So when we run this, we see here that we have three fields: ID, name, and level. Great. This is exactly what we wanted, right? Because ID is something that gets specified automatically. Name, well, name is coming from our model, and level, that's coming from our model too. So it looks like Django did a pretty decent job at turning our model from just a Python class into something that can go in our actual database. So this is basically the first step in interfacing between a SQL database and Python. So there's, let's see, a couple of other things that we can do. Before we do that, though, does anybody have any questions about anything we just did? About migrations, creating the model, checking the database?
How'd you access the database again?
So to access the database, it was this long command, which you can also find right here on today's curriculum page.
And you just stayed on the main folder, none of the Pokemon app or Pokemon projects?
Yes, so you'll want to run basically everything we run is always for Django is 90% of the time going to be from this main folder. So that's where your Docker Compose will live. That's where your VENV lives. That's where your manage.py lives. You want to stay there 90% of the time when we're doing things in Django.
Got it. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Go ahead, Tyler.
I think I messed up on the migrating part. I didn't realize I didn't have my container to continue running. When I go back, it looks like maybe I'm at Python manage.py migrate, and it says operations to perform, apply all migrations, admin, auth, content types, Pokemon app sessions, running migrations, no migration to apply. Do I have to? What did we do with that part?
Did you run make migrations beforehand?
I ran it, but I didn't have the container open, and now if I run make migrations, it says no changes detected.
Okay, gotcha. Here, do you want to maybe share your screen and let's try figuring it out?
Okay. Yeah, I didn't have my container running at first, and then I kind of went forwards, and I realized, oh, whoops, I missed a step, and then I went back.
So what I'd like you to do, can you delete your migrations folder? Just delete the whole thing. So deleting your migrations folder, it will not damage anything. Full disclosure. So if you ever run into a problem like this, just delete the whole thing. Before you make your migrations, Tyler, can you run the Docker Compose and just get that spun up?
You want me to close out of this one here, right?
Oh, so that's running?
Yes. Yeah, I'll just stop her, start her from scratch real quick.
Sure. Okay, so let's go back to your bash. And let's change level. Just make it like LEVELE or something. Like just change the name of the field. Sure. And let's make migrations again. Interesting. Question number 1. Did you save your models.py?
Yes. I have a autosave on.
Okay. Just make sure you do Command S as well, because autosave is great, but don't always trust it.
Okay.
So that generally works.
I hit Control S as well, but I figured I'd go back and hit that. Okay, so I saved it. Now you want me to try the migrations?
Yeah, let's try running the migrations one more time. All right, so no changes detected. That is a little bit weird. You know what? Why don't you do Python manage.py, make migrations, and then specify the app name. So make migration and then space, and then Pokemon underscore app. Okay, perfect. And also just go to your settings.py real quick. Just want to make sure that you added Pokemon app to the list of installed apps. Okay, perfect. So yeah, now your migrations have been created. So why don't you go ahead and do Python manage.py migrate. Interesting. No migrations to apply. Now let me look this up really quickly. Migrate Django.
I was trying to keep up, so it's definitely possible I missed something earlier on. Oh, you know what? Is this it? My port in quotes? That be a thing?
No, the port should. No, the port should be fine in quotes. Yeah, we'll spend like one more minute on this and then keep moving on.
Yeah, I'll roll
you know
through
what?
this again.
Why don't you say Python manage.py migrate and then Pokemon app? So the same thing you did for make migrations, basically.
So your engine is still SQLite instead of Postgres.
Oh, good catch, Tiffany. So yeah, on line 79, you'll want to change that SQLite 3 to Postgres or PostgreSQL.
And then maybe try to run it without the command and see what happens.
There we go. Awesome. So Tyler, glad we were able to get that working. And Tiffany, great catch. So yeah, just make sure that, because remember the make migrations part will basically tell Django, it's sort of like staging it. So it's telling Django, hey, turn my class into a model. And then the migrate part says, turn my model and put it into my database. So yeah. Alrighty, so let me go ahead and start sharing my screen again. And we've got just a little bit more content to go through. So let's see, how far are we now? So, okay, we'll do Django console next. Yeah, that should be fine. So we've applied it. Again, we checked our database to make sure that it exists in here. I'm just going to quit out of it. For now, I'll run it again in a little bit. So let's go back to our virtual environment. So, okay, great. We've created a Django data. We've created a database using Django. It doesn't have anything in it. So it's basically useless. So let's add some stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is dir, make sure that we're in the same folder as our manage.py. And because this is Django, we're going to say Python manage.py. And now we're going to enter into the shell. So this looks basically the same as if you type in just like Python and hit enter. The difference, though, is this Python manage.py shell is also a Django shell. So it's basically running a bunch of different Django-related commands in the background. So whenever we're using Django, we want to do something using Python, like in the terminal or in the console, you'll want to make sure you're using the shell for Django that's from manage.py. And this shell, crucially, will also allow us to interface basically directly with our database. So how can we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is import our model. So by importing our model, we're basically saying, all right, you know what database to go in, but let's go to this table. So we're going to say from, and where are our models? Our models are in Pokemon app dot models. Remember, it's a Python file. We're going to import the name of our model, which is Pokemon. No errors, so that imported okay. The next thing that we're going to do is create a brand new Pokemon. So let's start with everybody's favorite, Pikachu. I'll say Pikachu is going to be a new instance of the Pokemon class or a new Pokemon model. The name of Pikachu is, well, we should use single quotes, Pikachu. And the level of Pikachu is going to be 12. Hit enter. So, okay, great. Pikachu has been made, but it still is not in our database. To add Pikachu to our database, I now need to say Pikachu.save. And we'll get into more details about the save command later this week or next week. But basically, what we're doing here is we're basically creating a new model, creating a new instance of the class Pokemon. But when we say .save, it saves that Pokemon or that model to the database. So we can verify that it's in the database in a couple of ways. The first way we can do it is by saying Pokemon.objects.all. This is basically saying, give me all of the Pokemon objects, or select star from the Pokemon app Pokemon table. And we see here, we get something weird. What is this? Well, the first thing it returns is a query set. A query set is a Django type that we won't bother about now, but it basically returns all of, a query set is basically sort of like a list. Not really, but that's how you can think of it as. It's easier to say that a query set is basically like the result of a SQL query. What things are in that result of our SQL query? Well, in our Pokemon table, we have a Pokemon object with ID 1. Okay, great. So let's go and confirm that this thing is actually living in our database. So I'm going to exit out of my Python shell, going to go back here, and we're going to rerun my exec command so I can go into my container, and I'm going to select everything from the Pokemon table. And look at that. We now have a Pokemon in our Pokemon table, which is ID 1, the name is Pikachu, and the level is 12. I never went into Postgres and added this guy manually. Everything we did was all through Django and Python. But we have been able to successfully interface between Python scripts and SQL using Django as our intermediary. All right, so there's one more thing that we can do. I'm going to quit out of this for now. And that is relating to our admin site, which is this guy. So I guess before we move to the admin site first, does anybody have any questions about any of the models or anything that we did similar to that in Django? So the models interfacing between our database and via SQL and Python, anything like that? All right, no questions?
Only thing I'm curious about, sorry for taking so long. I didn't know if it was worth it. But the manage.py, like why do you always have to click manage.py like after you hit Python, like Python manage.py, and then your command?
So manage.py is basically let's see if I can open it. It's basically running a bunch of Django functions within it. It's relatively short, but it's running a bunch of Django things. So when we say Python manage.py and run this, it's basically saying, hey, Django, run all of the stuff related to this project. So it can be used to, again, like create a Django project or create a Django app, to make your migrations, to start your server, etc. All functions that aren't built into default like Python, like if you just open the shell and ran it, but they are built into Django. So by saying manage.run manage.py, you're basically saying run all of these Django specific functions.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Any other questions before we talk very briefly about the admin site? Okay, so there's one or two things that I want to just demonstrate very briefly before we wrap up Django for tonight. So we have our models here, and we've learned how to interface between the shell and Postgres. Great. What about interfacing with an actual website? This isn't something that was covered in the material for today, but I think it's something cool, so I just want to take a minute to show you guys. So to do that, we can go to admin.py, which is something that we can use in order to basically log into, well, an admin website that we can use to manage all of our databases. So there's a few things that we'll have to do. The first thing that we'll have to do is, well, register our models. So we're going to have to import our model first. And then after we import our model, we can register. So let me share my screen. So we'll say from, and look at where our models are. It's down here. We'll say from .models. I'm going to import my Pokemon model. And then I'm going to go admin dot, let me just remember the command very quickly. So admin dot site dot register Pokemon. So what this is basically doing is it's saying, all right, I want to create this admin website. And on my admin site, I'm going to give the site admin access to our Pokemon database. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and actually use our admin site. Before we use our admin site, though, I have to create an admin user because otherwise there's no way I can log into my admin site. So we'll say Python manage.py create super user. And this is going to create basically an admin user for our web page. Give it a second. I'm just going to say like admin is the username, admin@admin.org, and the password will be admin. And we'll bypass that. We've created a super user. The super user is basically going to be our site admin. And now I can say Python manage.py and run server. And what this will do is this is going to run a web server for us. The address of this web server is going to be localhost 8000. So I'm going to open this in my browser. Okay, we give it a second. And it says that Django is working. So I'm now going to go to my admin site, which I access here. Let me switch to my official Code Platoon browser. This one's fancier. We'll go to our admin site, give it a second, and we now are placed with this very nice HTML page. Note, I never actually made an HTML page. I mean, you guys saw everything I was doing from scratch. I never made a page like this. Where is that coming from? Well, this admin page is coming straight from Django. This is one of the nice functionalities that Django builds for us. So let me log in with my admin powers that I set up in that create super user command. Hit login. And I'm sure that a 5-letter password was found in a data breach, and that's not a concern of mine. And we see here we have a couple of things we can look at. We can create groups, which we don't need to worry about. We can create users, which right now is not something we're going to worry about, but this is something that we will be worrying about in a few weeks when we learn how to make users and authentication. And the very important thing, inside of our Pokemon app, we can look at all of our Pokemon. And we see here that we have Pokemon object number 1. The name of this object is Pikachu, and its level is 12. I can now go ahead and change the level of this guy to, let's say, 20. I can save it. And it says that this guy was changed successfully. I can go back in here, and we see here that it's running in the background. This website is running a bunch of things for us. We're not going to talk about what these are yet, but this will be important later on. Now, in the admin panel, again, I changed Pikachu from level 12 to level 20. I can confirm that this has changed by, let me take my script for entering into Postgres. I can run that in here, and we'll go ahead and select all, and look at that. The level of our Pokemon has changed from 12 to 20 inside our Postgres database. So what we've essentially done through this admin site is interface between an HTML web page, Python via Django, and our SQL database. We can also, just to show you a couple other things you can do, we can also add brand new Pokemons. So we can add in, let's say, a Charizard with level 15. And I can also add in a Bulbasaur with level 3. So we now have 3 Pokemon inside of my Django admin website. To confirm that these actually show up inside SQL, I can run my select star command, and ta-da! We now have 3 Pokemon inside of our actual database. So that was a very brief, and also let me quit out of this. And also, once you're done testing your server, just make sure to quit it using Control-C, so that way it doesn't keep running forever and use up computer resources. That's about it for today's lecture material. Does anybody have questions that I can answer about anything Django related, or SQL or anything like that?
What was that command you did to get into that website?
Sure. So the command was, so first you have to create a super user. So Python manage.py, create super user. And once you've created your super user, you'll do Python manage.py run server. And then once that server starts running, we'll go up a little bit. It'll tell you that starting a development server at localhost 8000. You can go to localhost 8000 and then type localhost 8000/admin, like it says up here, and then it'll take you to your admin login page.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. So also, I love using the admin site because, let's be honest, having a website with pretty decent CSS is a whole lot easier to use for testing and adding data than adding them in through ugly SQL terminal or Python. So that's my personal recommendation, is to use that. Any other questions I can answer? So I'm going to go ahead and stop the share, and